My name is Jared. I'm one of the pastors at Twin Lakes. This is my wife Alicia, my son Van. She's back here. My son Van's running around here somewhere. But I didn't actually I'm actually fairly new to Twin Lakes, and I didn't get there through the conventional way. In fact, even growing up in ministry, my dad was a pastor. I took about 18 years and worked outside of the church, and I was in the agency world, did design and branding for companies over the hill. It was an amazing experience. Towards the last 5 years, though, I burned through every reserve of adrenaline that I had available to me. And it was a pretty intense run. We would work all night. We traveled all over the world. I had hundreds of people working, well, actually a total of about 100 people working for me. And we, during that time, just worked on, I just burned every last bit of energy I had. And at the end of that 5 years, I crashed. It was bad. I grew a big beard, moved to Kauai. They called me Wilson. It was terrible. I live with my dad, 38. And during that time, I was experiencing some anxiety that was more intense than I've ever experienced. A very short time, never had before and never really after. And it was just a really intense time. And at that time, I kind of knew what it felt like, and many other experiences in my life, to feel hopeless. I was facing something that felt hopeless to me. Have you faced something hopeless in your life? I'm sure in a room this size, everybody can attest to that. What do you do? Where do you find hope? How do you get through those? That's what today is all about. I want to teach from the subject of hope is a person. And I'll explain that as we walk through this. But I think there's two traps that we can fall into when we face things that feel dark and hopeless to us. On one hand, I think we can fight against the trial. And that doesn't always work really well. Because what happens is you end up trying to change things that are out of your control, and it doesn't always go the way you want it to. On the other side, you can just give up and not do anything and just say, and give in to like the trial. And that could be really painful as well. So how do we avoid these two extremes? Well, in order to find our hope, we need to know where to look when we are in these situations. And that's what today's passage is all about. If you guys have your Bibles, you want to turn there, Matthew 17:1. I'll get into it. But first I want to ask you, how many of you know who this man is right here? Okay. Yeah, okay, good. I asked the Vintage College group at Vintage Faith Church, and only 20% of them knew who that was. It made me feel very old. But I'm like, that's the man, the myth, the legend, Matthew McConaughey. Now, I love Matthew McConaughey. He's one of my favorite actors. I've watched him all the way back to A Time to Kill. He was in, of course, Contact, which you may have not even known. I forgot that, but he was in it. Lincoln Lawyer, in his newest one, Interstellar, if you've ever seen it. But his greatest cinematic masterpiece, his crown jewel, if you will, has to be Surfer Dude. If you haven't seen it, actually, please don't ever see it. You're probably better off not having seen it. But as a fan of Matthew, I thought I knew him. When 2007, Leisha and I got invited to go to the Country Music Awards, some friends that were connected. And so we show up in Vegas, and they're part of the event. So we're with them hanging out. We're in the back of the MGM, and there's a line of limos, and we step out. We're dressed for the occasion. 2 kids from Oregon, completely out of our element here. And our friend says, hey, get in that limo. Well, there's a pink limo. And so Alicia and I get in this pink limousine, and we're sitting there, and they start driving us. And what we didn't realize is they were driving us to the red carpet at the front of the hotel where all the celebrities were getting out. Well, in front of us was Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban. Behind us was Dierks Bentley and Blake Shelton and Carrie Underwood. I mean, it was wild, right? But people are banging on our windows thinking we're one of them. We're just 2 kids from Oregon. We do not belong here. And they think we're a celebrity. So I'm so glad that I captured this moment and realized how unique it was, because I was able to capitalize on it. When I pulled up, I opened the door, and I was like, I don't know what to do. So I just opened the door, and I just went, yeah. The crowd went absolutely wild. I'm not kidding you. They went wild for about 2 seconds. And then they realized, who is this guy? You know, he's nobody. And so they just usher us off behind the curtain. But it was my one moment of fame. Well, afterwards, we got invited to go to Matthew McConaughey's dinner party. Right? So, oh, cool. But, you know, I'm going to figure I'm going to just be one of 200 people standing there against the wall, you know, in the back. Well, we show up to Tao's restaurant, and there was a table that was set for like 30 people. Not one person in the seat. At the very end, McConaughey and Camilla, Matthew and Camilla, we were the only ones that showed up to his dinner party. So we get there, and we sit down, us and the other couple, and we just had a great night. Because we were the only ones that showed up to the party, he pulled out the full McConaughey experience. He brought sushi, and other celebrities were stopping by. He was telling us about his story, his life, his kids, and he's a Christian. And I got to know him on this different level, right? I remember when I shook his hand, well, after the end of that night, he said, we're going to go out and, you know, hit the town and like see shows. And he asked the couple we were with if they wanted to come, and they said, oh, no, we got to go on a plane. And he looked at me and Alicia, and he says, do you guys want to go? And I'm like thinking like, yeah, yes, but I can't. I've got a plane too. And I know what you're thinking. Just bag the plane, man. Go on, you know. And I've regretted that decision many times. But I remember when I met Matthew, he reached out and he said, hey, my name's Matthew. And I reached out and I said, hey, I know, right? Because I thought I knew Matthew. I thought I knew who he was based on the culture. Now, it's very interesting because I find this connection to be the same with Jesus. A lot of people in our culture think they know Jesus, but rarely ever take the time to evaluate what their beliefs about him are and ask that question, do I really know who Jesus is? There's a lot of ideas about who he is, and that's a really important thing. In fact, Jesus asked his disciples this very question in a little town called Caesarea Philippi. He said, who do you say that I am? This very famous question. And it's echoed throughout time because it is the most important question that anybody, past, present, or future, can ask and answer. But before that, he asked them, who do people say that I am? So if you were around at that time and you were Israel and you were paying attention, it was pretty obvious. There were some signs. The Gospel of Matthew was actually written, when you read through the Gospel of Matthew, to show Jesus as this coming Messiah, the second Moses. And if people were looking, they would have seen that Jesus was born of a virgin, fulfilling Isaiah's prophecy that he would be wonderful counselor, mighty God. He was baptized in the Jordan River with a voice that came from heaven saying, this is my son. He speaks with authority over God's law in the Sermon on the Mount. He feeds people from heaven. He walks on the water. He commands the winds and the waves, and they obey him. So if they were looking, they would have seen. So the cultural, the disciples give some cultural answers, what the people might have thought at that time. But then he makes it personal, and he looks right at them and he says, yeah, but who do you say that I am? Peter quickly answers. He says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus said, yes, that's correct. Great. We're on. We're in. Let's go. And he says, but you're going to follow me here. This is the last few verses of chapter 16. You're going to follow me. We're going to go to Jerusalem where I'm going to be handed over and killed. And I'm asking you guys to go with me. Well, Peter wasn't having it. Got right up in Jesus' face, said, no, you cannot do that. Absolutely no. And Jesus stopped him and rebuked him, and he said, you're not seeing the bigger plan here. Then he tells him about what it means to be a disciple. He said, if you don't take up your cross, which is a symbol of death to your old life, you're not worthy to be my disciple. But he doesn't leave him with that. He reasons with him. He says, but it's a better path. And I'll tell you why, because what does it gain for you to, or what does it profit you to gain the whole world but lose your soul? Follow me, become my disciple. Yeah. And Jesus not only calls him to follow them to his death, but also their own ultimately. And they would need some serious hope for this, They're heading into a dark tunnel. Desmond Tutu, a theologian, said, hope is being able to see that there is light despite all the darkness. To see that there is light at the end of the tunnel was super important for Peter and the disciples because they had to follow into this dark place. And there was light. In fact, verse 27, Jesus said, I'm coming back in the glory of the Father. Yes, I will die, but I am actually coming back in the glory of the Father. And he points to him and he says, you know, you guys right here standing, some of you are going to get a glimpse of that. And they do. And right after this, he selected 3 of those men, the people who were going to get a glimpse, and he revealed who he truly was to them in a way that was amazing, epic, and actually quite historically powerful. And this event actually changed everything. Peter references it later as being the main evidence that he believes in Jesus. So this event was really important. It had the power to change their lives, and it also has the power to change our lives as well. This is where we pick up the story in verse 1 of chapter 17. It says, after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up to a high mountain by themselves. Verse 1. So where is this high mountain? Well, there's a lot of mountains in Israel that might be this place. Nobody really knows, but I know where I think it is, and that is Mount Hermon. In fact, Mount Hermon's the biggest mountain, not the camp, the real Mount Hermon. And it's the biggest mountain in Israel. And I've actually stood there on the Golan Heights and looked at the Mount Hermon, and Caesarea Philippi is right down at the base. So they would have walked most likely up this mountain. But why did he take Peter, James, and John? Well, we can look at the Old Testament and we can kind of get an idea that in that world, an event is actually validated or confirmed by 3 witnesses, sort of legally. But I find it interesting that in chapter 16, verse 1, in Caesarea Philippi, the Pharisees and scribes came to Jesus and they're like, hey, we'll believe in you if you show us a sign. And Jesus said, no, he didn't give them anything. But to these guys who made that commitment or that confession of faith to him, he's going to show them something that will blow their mind, that will open their eyes. Why is that? It's because hope always begins with belief. Hope always begins with belief. Belief is the first step to opening that door of hope. They needed this moment to strengthen them for the road ahead. They have put their faith, they've made that confession of faith. They needed this time alone with Jesus, without distraction, away from all the noise, to see this moment. And Luke tells us at one point as they were traveling that they stopped to pray. And something epic happens. Jesus says there, Jesus was transfigured before them. So transfigured is the Greek word metamorpho, which essentially means to change into another form. I mean, it was so dramatic that it was actually a full form shifting thing happening here. So what did it look like? Well, it says that his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. Now, if you're a reader of the Old Testament, you might remember somebody else who had a similar thing happen. Do you know who I'm talking about? Moses. Nice. Great job. Moses had a similar experience where he met God. There's this moment where he actually saw God, and he was so bright from seeing God that he actually shone, and people could see it on him, right? And it tells us in Exodus that he actually wore a veil, and I always wondered why he wore a veil. Was it because, it was too bright or whatever? But it tells us he wore a veil because he didn't want the people of Israel to see it fade. So it was really a reflection, right? But there's something different because Jesus didn't reflect God. He radiated. That means it's coming out from within him. It's beaming from within. So in the comparison of Moses and Jesus, actually Jesus is more like God in that story than he is Moses, right? That's our first clue. Little hint dropped about who Jesus is. He's more like God in the story than he was Moses. So then, just then, appeared before him Moses and Elijah, and they were talking with Jesus. So I don't know if these guys just walked out of the bushes or what, but two extra dudes, they just walk out. And they knew them to be Moses and Elijah. Why Moses and Elijah? Why would they show up? Well, Moses, we know, as always represents the law. And Jesus said in Matthew 5 that he came to fulfill the law, meaning his life is a perfect representation. He came to live out the law perfectly. And Elijah was a prophet. So we find out in John 5 that John 5:39, that all prophets testify ultimately to Jesus. So here we have Jesus, the law, and the prophets all together, this epic moment. But it's also a picture, by the way, of eternity. What do I mean by that? They were standing and talking with personally resurrected saints. So if we believe their testimony, they were standing with Moses. After he physically died, he lived on. Right? This shatters the atheist claim that Richard Dawkins says, that says religion teaches the dangerous nonsense that death is not the end. A lot of people live under this hopeless statement. A lot of people live with this framework and reality. Thank God we have hope, and that's not something that we believe and we know to be true. And why is that? Because what credential would you have, I was thinking about this, would you need to have to be able to make a claim like that? That's a pretty bold claim, right? No PhD, multiple PhDs not going to give me, he's never died. So how does he know? I put my chips in with Jesus, who actually died and came back. Most documented miracle. Came back to tell us what it's like. I'd much rather trust him than this dude who never died, right? So this story actually shows us the opposite of what Richard Dawkins is saying here. And it shows us that we are eternal beings. Death is not the end for us. For Peter and James and John, they're going to see Jesus die. They themselves will die, and they're seeing that's not the end. So Peter didn't want to leave. Actually, let me jump back here. It's because hope always offers a future. That's the second point. Hope promises a future. So Peter's sitting here, and this is the calm before the storm for him. And he says, Lord, it's good for us to be here. Let's not do that cross thing. Let's stay right here. If you wish, I will put up 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. We could just hang out here. Let's just be here in this moment. So they were heading into this dark place, and he wanted to stay right there on the mountain. It's interesting he uses the word tabernacles, another little reference to the Old Testament. Where's the tabernacle? You guys know? The book of Numbers, Israel. And the tabernacle was the place that God dwelt. It was the dwelling place of God. Something happened in that tabernacle that happens in this moment. It says that while Peter was speaking, a bright cloud covered them. Numbers 16:42, the same thing happened in the tabernacle in Israel. The cloud filled the tabernacle, representing God's presence among the people and in that place. But there's something different, because a voice came out, and from the voice it said, "This is my son, whom I am well pleased." And he gives a simple command: listen to him. So this is our second clue. Not only do we have God's presence represented, the tabernacle, but we have a voice from heaven pointing to Jesus, the radiant one, as the Son of God. And this simple call to action was, listen to him, just like Moses said years earlier, which we'll talk about in a minute. So this reminds us that hope is always rooted in truth. To listen to Jesus is to understand him, obey him, trust him, listen to his truth. Hope is rooted in truth. So right then, the disciples heard this. They fell face down. This experience drew them to the ground. It says they were terrified. It's the same reaction Moses had at the burning bush and when he saw God. It was just so overwhelming that they were just brought down to their face in a posture of worship. And then everything settled, and Jesus went over and touched them, and he said these words. He said, "Arise, don't be afraid." You can just take those words, highlight them in your Bible, write them down, put them in your pocket when you go through times. Arise, do not be afraid. And I almost imagine this being a cinematic moment where they looked up, and it says there that they were left only looking at Jesus in that very moment. Now they stood up looking at Jesus with a new hope and a new view on reality and a new understanding of who he was. So hope begins with belief. It's grounded in truth and it promises a future, but belief in what? Belief, what is the truth and what is that future in? A better question is who? Starts to be a picture emerging here of Jesus that hope is a person. What Matthew's trying to show us is that Jesus is much more than a good teacher, much more than a man. If you combine all of these events that you're looking at, you combine the little clues that we see that Jesus is God. And you might be thinking, yeah, well, I know that. I've come to church. I'm a Christian. But you'd be surprised. There was a study done by Ligonier Ministries, and there was this was in 2023, a bunch of evangelical Christians that were surveyed, and over 48% of them said they believed Jesus was not God. They use the word divine, they'll redefine it, say good teacher. So this is an important thing. In fact, if you if you want to know more about this, you can talk to Adam about it, or you can look at your doctrine statement on your website. But it's really important to know what you believe about Jesus, because it is what differentiates us from all the other world religions and cults and things like that. So basically, just when you look at this word that came down from the cloud, he said, "This is my son." Now, when we think about that, we think sort of like an earthly relationship, father and son. But as you dig deeper in Hebrews 1:3, it says that Jesus shares the same nature as God. So it's a little bit different in that regard. We see that Jesus is the embodiment of God in human form. And again, as I mentioned earlier in 2 Peter writes, and he says, this event, and he points to this transfiguration moment, he said that's the event that he rested his belief on. Yeah, the resurrection is the event, the most important event, but Peter just says this was the one. We saw Jesus in his glory. We know he is God. So Peter needed this experience. He needed this because he was heading to the cross, and Jesus' identity is the foundation of hope for him and us. If we truly know that Jesus is God, he is in control, he loves us, he's with us, and he can be there through our trials. That gives us hope. That gives us hope. The second is Jesus is the truth. Hope is also grounded in truth. That simple command, listen to him, which is the exact thing that Moses said generations earlier. He said, someone's coming that is going to be like me, so listen to him. He's going to teach you, he's going to tell you, command you, he's going to give you your commands. Listen to what he commands. So what does Jesus command? In 1 John 3:23, it says, and this is his command, to believe in the name of his son, Jesus Christ. Hope begins with belief. This is where we start. Without Jesus, it does end up looking pretty grim. And so he's saying, hey, put your faith in me. And that's the beginning. That's that step of salvation. I find it interesting because a lot of people today will stand and say, hey, I demand you show me something, God, before I'll believe in you. Right? And meanwhile, he has revealed himself through creation. Go to Lake Tahoe. Just walk out. Look at a tree. Look at a baby, a newborn baby. Look around. You can see God has generally revealed himself to us very clearly. It's a big old painting to say that there's a painter behind this. In fact, I was talking to a young girl at the beach with Alicia, and she was doing a volleyball game, and I was talking to this girl on the side, and she said, I don't think God even knows I exist. I don't think he even knows me. I don't think he even... And I was like, okay, tell me about your life. So she starts telling me about her life, and as she's telling me her story, I just started noticing that, man, God's been all over your story. And I told her that. I said, I don't know if you see it, but I see that the Lord, like God's been talking to you all through your life. And she was just like, I guess, blown away. She told Alicia later, she's like, man, what Jared said, I didn't even know I said anything, you know. It was like, well, it was a very pastoral moment. God's fingerprint is all over your, no, it's just like I just said, I see God in your life. And she goes, wow. And she saw that, but it just took that retrospectively to look back and to see, oh, wow, God actually is there, right? But it's that when we first take that step of belief, oftentimes then our eyes are opened. And then the third thing is Jesus is our hope. President Cornelius Snow, you know who that is? Hunger Games. He said a famous quote. He said, hope is the only thing stronger than fear. If you guys have seen the movie Hunger Games. Now, in his context, it's a little weird. A bunch of teenagers, killing themselves in the woods. But it's a true statement, so we'll pull it out of that context. It is true, though. Hope is the only thing greater than fear. See, Jesus promised resurrection. He promised that he will return. This is a cornerstone of our hope. That the fact that Jesus is coming back, he will come back in the same way he left, and he will establish his kingdom. We know that that's the case. And this transfiguration moment was a sneak peek of that reality. He's going to come back in that same glory. So we can be assured that he will return for us, just like he promised. If you think about it too, all the way back from when Moses had prophesied that Jesus would come, there was a lot of space in between there. And it was probably very hard for Israel to hold the faith. When's that Jesus coming? When's that Messiah coming? Isaiah 53, years go by, generations pass. And then one day, a little boy is born in Bethlehem. The promise came fulfilled. And in the same way, Jesus will return in the same glory that he showed here. He is our hope. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, there's two traps. You've got this side of pushing against, fighting against the trial. Then you've got this just give up and just completely give up in life. And I think there's a third way. As I was preparing and praying about this, I know that every one of you has different situations that you've faced. And as Pastor Renee actually called me and Alicia this week and said, hey, would you be willing to tell your story? And I'm going to let Alicia sort of share through this video a situation that she went through that felt hopeless and that we went through as a family. And then I'll close this in prayer, but go and watch this video.
My husband Jared and I had just celebrated our 10-year wedding anniversary, and we were enjoying this beautiful season with the birth of our baby boy after 5 years of infertility. And the season ahead just felt like it was filled with hope. And what we didn't realize was that we were getting ready to face a storm that was bigger than anything we could ever imagine. I was diagnosed with a very rare, very aggressive form of breast cancer at 28. And as a nurse and a high-capacity person, my first instinct was to assemble the best medical team and the best facilities and do all the research that I could to make sure that I made it through this. It was really challenging for me because at the end of all my research, I didn't get the peace that I was looking for. I actually felt much more afraid. The reality that my son might not have a mom really started to weigh on me. My father-in-law was in town when we were going through all of this, and he saw that hopelessness in my face. He looked me in the eye and he said, Alicia, do you remember that story of Peter being called out into the storm to trust Jesus? He reminded me that I am facing a very similar thing, that Jesus is calling me out into the unknown, and there were going to be wind and waves and uncertainty, but that he was going to be with me and to keep my eyes on him. In this painting of Peter, he's depicted stepping out of the boat and he's looking back and his hand is barely let go. This is his security, but he knows he needs to look to Jesus. And that was the point in my treatment where every medical hope that I had run out. My body was rejecting the chemo. and I wasn't able to continue. I was still 2 months shy of where they wanted me to be. And our last resort was surgery. I had to cling to Jesus for everything I had. There was no more hope in the boat, and I had to commit. And there was this incredible peace that came from it just being me and him, and not being responsible for the outcome or the process, but just being with him. And that's when I really experienced God's peace in a way that I never have. And it was totally separate from my circumstances. I went in for surgery, and a couple days before Christmas, I got a call that God had already dealt with the cancer on his own, and I was done. My encouragement to you, if you're going through a storm, is to hold on to Jesus for dear life. He doesn't promise that there won't be storms, but he does promise to be with us in the storm, and he will be with you just like he was with Peter and like he was with me.
Yeah. Thank you, Alicia, for doing that. Thank you for putting that together and being vulnerable and sharing your story and letting us share it with you guys today. That was a very intense season. And as I was, again, praying about this, I thought, the thing that I take from this, it is sometimes we want a very practical handle. Like when I'm going through something really tough, I want practical advice on how to deal with it. And yes, the research that we did and all the stuff with the medical and all that stuff, it was important. But ultimately, what gave us hope in that season was knowing that Jesus said, yeah, you're going to go through this, but I will be with you. I will be with you. And we had moments where we would remember that, and we knew he was with us. In the same way that I would give my son hope by walking into the room when he was scared. His fear goes away. That same kind of feeling Alicia and I experienced during that season of cancer. And our conclusion as we came to that was, our hope is ultimately in the person of Jesus. And I love her last line where she says, Jesus doesn't say we won't promise us that we won't hit hard times. But what he does promise is that he will be in that with you, going along with you. So that would be the third way of approaching situations that feel hopeless. Let me pray for you. Father, I thank you so much for this wonderful church. I pray, Lord, that you would remind us, Lord, that you're in control, that you truly are who you say you are. You are God, and you are in control. And whatever we are facing and whatever anyone is facing here, I pray, Lord, that they would cling on to that truth and that reality. We love you. We praise your name. Amen. God bless you guys.